We were sent a question by a good friend of mine called Leet. And Leet, if you're watching this, hi. And yes, it's time to go skiing again, I think. Anyway, it's lovely to hear from you. The question was about fossilization, about those mistakes which just never seem to go. And yet, if students keep making the same mistakes, it's not good for them, especially if they want to sort of reach higher academic levels and things like that. And so Leet's question was what to do about this, and it's a good question. If people really knew the answer, well, we'd all be a lot happier. But I think for me, traditional routes of correction, for example, aren't going to do the trick because they haven't done the trick so far, so why should they do the trick now? Much better are to develop in students critical faculties to allow them to work out what they're doing and what they're writing. So one example of this I found recently, and I can't remember the article off the top of my head, I put it in the latest edition of my Practice of English Language Teaching, is where teachers get their students to write something and using lots of third conditionals, and then they show them a piece of writing which has third conditionals in it, and they say to the students, compare, do the two things, have you used yours in the same way as this piece of good writing has used it? Now, I'm not arguing here for the teaching of the third conditional, that's not the point, but the point of getting students to try and be critical enough of their own performance to compare on their own the way they've done something and the way that a text has done something seems to me to be maybe a kind of pointer to the direction we have to go in. There's a technique which many people are familiar with called dictogloss, which argues for the same kind of critical awareness. And that's where students hear a short text a few times, and then they try and recreate the text exactly, and then they compare what they've done with the text they've heard, because they're allowed to see it. And so the idea is that in noticing the differences between that, they learn something about their own language. For me, it is all a question about that kind of analysis. That kind of analysis of analysing text, of analysing good English text, and then comparing that analysis with what the students have written. Of constantly saying to students, how could you write this differently? Find examples of someone else who's written the same kind of thing. Is it the same as yours? And what's the difference? And does that mean that you might want to modify what you've done? It's that kind of analysis, that kind of area that I think works. It's, for example, in EAP, in English for Academic Purposes, getting students to analyse how texts are constructed, analysing the discourse of a decent paragraph. How do you put paragraphs together, and then saying, now what about you? Is your paragraph written in the same way? It's things like when students are going to do some work, getting them to think themselves of how they should evaluate their work when it's done, and making a list of the things they want to evaluate before they do it, so that then when they've done it, they can look back at what they've recorded on audio, what they've written, and that kind of thing, and see if they've met their own criteria, their own guidelines. It's the question of quite a few people, Tony Lynch was one of them, have talked about getting students to record themselves and then go back to the recording again and again, and each time try and make it better and analyse it and think how well they've done it. It's the idea of students collecting a list of their own typical errors and mistakes that they make, which they get from the teacher over a period of time. And then every time they write something or they record something, they look at this list of errors that they know they are prone to, and they try to work out whether they've made them, and so on and so forth. I think fossilization is a very big issue. It's a very big problem. Because we all get to a level of comfort in the languages we speak, apart from our own first language, and I guess you sort of lose your own sharpness about whether you're making mistakes or not. And just as we have our own idiosyncrasies in our first language when we speak it, so we develop idiosyncrasies in our second languages when we speak them. But I think the only answer to that fossilization is to develop in the students their own critical consciousness about what they're doing. And some of the things I've been talking about are ways of doing that. That's sort of my answer, Leet. I hope that was all right, and see you soon.